Meet Bob Vinnis, a man who wasn't just a photographer. He was a seeker, an explorer of the world's most hidden and untamed places. For Bob, every frame told a story, every journey was a quest, and every wilderness was a living, breathing canvas waiting to be captured. Born in the Midwest in the early 1920s, Bob grew up with an insatiable hunger for adventure. As a young boy, he would spend hours wandering through the dense forests near his home, imagining himself on grand expeditions. By the time he reached adulthood, his dreams had transformed into a career that took him to the most remote and wild corners of the earth. Bob wasn't like other photographers. While most sought the safety of the well-worn trails and the comfort of guided tours, Bob craved the unknown. His lens captured not just the beauty of nature, but its raw, unforgiving power. He had a reputation for going further, pushing harder, and seeing what others couldn't, or wouldn't, dare to see. And it was this relentless spirit that led him to the eerie wilderness of Crater Lake National Park in the winter of 1964. Friends and family would often ask him why he chose such perilous paths, why he would set out alone into landscapes where nature ruled without mercy. His answer was always the same: a simple, unwavering smile followed by the words, "The untouched is where life still speaks in its purest form." Bob lived for these moments, when the biting cold of winter winds would pierce through his thick jacket, when the crunch of untouched snow underfoot would echo in the silence of the forest, when the natural world around him would whisper secrets long forgotten by man. But what he didn't know, what he could never have prepared for, was that this trip to Crater Lake would be his last. This journey, unlike all the others, would end in a chilling mystery that remains unsolved to this day. So, on a cold December morning, armed with his trusted camera, a backpack filled with gear meticulously chosen for the extreme winter conditions, and a map marked with the routes less traveled, Bob Vinnis set off. Alone, as always, but with a sense of purpose that had guided him through countless expeditions before. The snow fell lightly at first, a gentle curtain descending upon the rugged landscape, as Bob ventured deeper into the heart of the wilderness. Little did he know, this time, the wilderness would not let him go. As the days grew shorter and the snow deeper, Bob ventured into the heart of Crater Lake National Park, where few had dared to tread, especially in the dead of winter. His breath fogged the frigid air with each step, his boots crunching through the layers of untouched snow that blanketed the forest floor. This was the kind of journey he lived for, a place where silence hung heavy and time seemed to stretch and slow, unbound by the trappings of civilization. Here, in this isolated expanse of raw nature, Bob felt most alive. Armed with his well-worn camera slung across his neck, he made his way along the edge of the caldera. The lake below, vast and silent, reflected the gray sky like a giant, unmoving mirror. Bob paused often, capturing the ghostly beauty of the snow-laden trees and the jagged cliffs that seemed to rise up like the spines of ancient beasts. Each shot was meticulously framed, each click of the shutter a deliberate act of preservation, a way to hold onto the fleeting, ephemeral moments that nature so rarely offered up. Despite his years of experience, Bob knew he had to be cautious. The cold out here could kill a man in hours if he wasn't careful. He'd come prepared for the harsh conditions. His pack was heavy with supplies. Extra layers of clothing, enough food to last him 2 weeks, a compass, a map, and his trusty knife. He even carried a small flare gun, a last resort for emergencies. But deep down, he relished the solitude, the challenge of being out here with nothing but his wits and instincts to guide him. The first few days were a balance of wonder and routine. Bob would rise at dawn, eat a quick breakfast, and then set off, winding his way deeper into the wilderness. Each night, he'd make camp in a new location, choosing a spot with a clear view of the stars. He was meticulous in his planning, making sure to mark his trail and keep a detailed log of his movements. In his journal, he wrote about the serenity of the landscape, the way the snow seemed to muffle the world around him, creating a cocoon of stillness that was both beautiful and unnerving. But even in these early days, there were signs, small, almost imperceptible signs, that something was off. The birds, which usually filled the forest with their song, were strangely silent. The air, though crisp and cold, seemed to carry an unusual weight, as if charged with a static electricity that raised the hairs on the back of his neck. Bob brushed it off at first, chalking it up to the natural eeriness of being so far from civilization. After all, he'd been in some pretty remote places before, and the mind could play tricks on a person when they were alone for too long. Still, there were moments when he couldn't shake the feeling that he was not as alone as he thought. He would occasionally catch movement out of the corner of his eye, just a shadow or a flicker of light between the trees. But when he turned to look, there was nothing there. And yet, his heart would pound just a little harder, his hand instinctively tightening around the grip of his camera as if it were some sort of talisman against the unknown. As the third day dawned, a heavy fog rolled in, blanketing the forest in a thick, soupy haze that obscured everything more than a few feet ahead. Visibility was poor, and the cold seemed to seep deeper into his bones. But Bob was undeterred. He'd faced worse conditions before. Pushing forward, he decided to head towards a clearing he'd marked on his map, a spot that promised a sweeping view of the lake from a higher vantage point. With a sense of purpose driving each step, he continued on, unaware that this fog was only the beginning. The deep woods around Crater Lake had been waiting, biding their time, and now, as Bob plunged further into their grasp, they were ready to reveal their true nature. Crater Lake, a place of breathtaking beauty, was also a place with a dark and tangled history. Locals knew the stories, the tales that parents would tell to their children to keep them from wandering too far into the woods. Stories of strange disappearances, odd happenings, and the feeling that something ancient and unseen prowled beneath the shadows of those towering pines. As Bob continued deeper into this forbidding wilderness, he became unknowingly entwined in these tales, a living chapter in a book filled with fear and mystery. To the untrained eye, Crater Lake is just a serene body of water surrounded by thick forests and rugged cliffs. But to those who have lived near it for generations, it is a place where the boundary between the natural and the supernatural is thin, where the veil separating the known world from the unknown frays just enough for things to slip through. From the Native American tribes who once regarded the lake as a place of forbidden power to the modern-day rangers who quietly swapped ghost stories around campfires, the deep woods of Crater Lake held a reputation that even the skeptics couldn't entirely ignore. There were whispers of figures seen moving among the trees, figures that were there one moment, gone the next, leaving no trace but a cold, lingering dread. The park's early explorers told of strange lights that flickered across the water at night, darting beneath the surface like living, breathing stars. There were accounts of strange, low-frequency hums resonating through the ground, inexplicable to scientists and unsettling to those who heard them. And then there were the disappearances. Over the decades, hikers, hunters, and even experienced outdoorsmen had entered these woods and never returned. Search parties found nothing. No bodies, no gear, not even a footprint. Just the haunting emptiness of a forest that seemed to swallow them whole. As Bob made his way further along the ridgeline, the fog clinging to the trees like cobwebs, he remained unaware of these dark tales. He wasn't one for superstition. His world was one of logic, science, and the perfect shot. But if he'd known about these stories, perhaps he would have paid more attention to the unsettling quiet that seemed to grow thicker with each step. Perhaps he would have questioned why he hadn't seen a single animal in days, not even a deer track or a squirrel's nest. Perhaps he would have noticed how even the snow seemed oddly undisturbed, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. By the fourth day, Bob began to feel it. The unsettling awareness that Crater Lake was not just another wilderness. It was a place where the rules of nature bent and twisted, where the unseen could watch and wait. It started as a gnawing sensation in the pit of his stomach, a discomfort that crept in whenever he stopped to catch his breath. He would look around, feeling the eyes of the forest upon him, and yet see nothing but the skeletal branches of trees lost in the fog. He told himself it was just the isolation playing tricks on him. It was easy for the mind to wander in the silence, to create phantoms in the mist. But the silence was not ordinary. It was heavy, oppressive, as if the very air was pressing in around him, filled with something unspoken. The forest felt alive, conscious in a way that made his skin prickle. It wasn't just a void, it was a presence. And then, as he approached a dense cluster of ancient pines, he saw something that made him stop in his tracks. A shape, a human-like silhouette, standing perfectly still between the trees. Bob's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in sharp, cold bursts. He lifted his camera, squinting through the viewfinder, but by the time he focused the lens, the figure was gone. Only the mist remained, swirling slowly as if stirred by some unseen force. For the first time in his life, Bob felt truly alone, not just physically, but existentially. A speck of insignificance in a vast, indifferent wilderness that seemed to watch him with a knowing, almost predatory gaze. His grip tightened on his camera, and he pressed on, his steps quickening, as if he could outrun whatever it was that lurked in those deep woods. The lake and the trees, once his subjects, were now something else entirely. He was no longer an observer. He had become a part of the story, and the story was just beginning. Bob pushed further into the forest, his heart still racing from the sight of that shadowy figure. He told himself it was a trick of the light, a play of shadows and fog. Yet, the unsettling feeling clung to him like the cold air, refusing to dissipate. He needed to refocus. The rhythmic crunch of his boots on the snow became his anchor, a steady, repetitive sound that grounded him amidst the growing unease. He knew he had to keep moving. Staying still in this vast, silent place only invited more of those creeping thoughts to take hold. The path was growing narrower, the trees pressing closer together, their limbs intertwining like skeletal fingers reaching toward the sky. Bob's eyes scanned the landscape, his photographer's instinct taking over, searching for the perfect composition. Despite the strangeness around him, the artist in him couldn't help but admire the stark beauty of the forest. The world was stripped down to its bones, branches bare, snow pure and untouched. He stopped briefly to capture a photograph of the mist weaving through the pines, a hauntingly beautiful dance of light and shadow. The click of the shutter was a small comfort, a reminder of his purpose here. This was what he had come for, after all, to capture the untamed, the raw, the untouched. But even as he clicked through his shots, the forest seemed to close in tighter. There was an unnatural thickness in the air now, an oppressive weight that seemed to settle on his shoulders. The fog swirled around him, and for a moment, he felt dizzy, as if the ground beneath him had shifted. He shook it off, trying to clear his head, but the sense of disorientation lingered. It was like the forest itself was shifting, rearranging its paths in a deliberate attempt to confuse him. As he continued on, Bob began to notice subtle changes in the landscape. The trees seemed older, their bark twisted and gnarled as if warped by some ancient force. The snow, once powdery and light, had taken on a strange texture, coarser, almost granular, like tiny fragments of bone. And the quiet, it had deepened into something more than silence. It was an absence of sound so complete, so unnatural, that it felt as if the forest were holding its breath, waiting. Then, the unease became a sharp stab of fear. Up ahead, something broke the monotony of white and gray, something dark. At first, it looked like a large boulder, an outcrop peeking through the snow. But as Bob drew nearer, he realized it was something else entirely. It was an old tree, twisted and blackened, its trunk split wide open as if struck by lightning. Around its base, the snow was disturbed, scattered with strange, small bones, too small to be human, but oddly shaped and brittle. Bob crouched down, snapping photos, his hands shaking slightly as he documented the scene. The air here was different, heavier, charged with a faint metallic tang that clung to the back of his throat. There was a faint, almost imperceptible hum vibrating through the ground beneath him. He stood up slowly, his breath coming in short, visible puffs. His instincts told him to turn back, to leave this place. But he'd come too far to turn around now, and a deeper curiosity tugged at him. A compulsion to know more, to see more. As he moved past the blackened tree, he noticed something etched into its bark. Symbols, crude and jagged, like ancient runes carved with a shaking hand. He leaned in closer, tracing one of them with his gloved finger. They were fresh, as if made recently, but he saw no tracks, no sign that anyone else had been here. His heartbeat quickened. Could it be a message? A warning? A sudden gust of wind cut through the trees, bitterly cold, sending a shiver down his spine. The fog parted for just a moment, revealing the path ahead. A dark, narrow corridor winding deeper into the woods. Bob hesitated. The rational part of his mind screamed at him to turn around, to head back to camp and wait for the morning light. But the deeper, more instinctual part of him, the part that had driven him into these woods in the first place, urged him on. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. His decision was made. With a final, wary glance at the twisted tree and its strange markings, he tightened his grip on his camera and pressed forward into the unknown, each step taking him further away from the familiar and deeper into the dark heart of Crater Lake's wilderness. As Bob ventured deeper into the woods, the narrow path twisted and turned, leading him into a darker, more tangled part of the forest. The trees here were massive, ancient sentinels that seemed to bend inward, forming a canopy so dense that it almost blotted out the sky. The light was dim, the fog thicker, swirling around his legs like the tendrils of some phantom presence. With every step, the temperature seemed to drop a few more degrees, and the forest's silence grew even more profound, more suffocating. The snow crunched under his boots, a brittle, echoing sound that seemed to hang in the air far longer than it should. Bob's breath came in short bursts, visible in the cold, his eyes scanning the surroundings. He was looking for anything, a landmark, a sign, a break in the dense tree line. But everything looked the same, a disorienting maze of twisted trunks and fog-draped branches. The sense of being watched had intensified, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling with an unseen tension that refused to leave him. He wasn't alone out here. He could feel it. Something was watching, waiting. Then, in a clearing ahead, he spotted something unusual. A pattern in the snow. A circle, not quite perfect, but unmistakably deliberate. Inside the circle, the snow was packed down, almost flattened, as if by something heavy pressing down on it. Around the circle's edge were smaller indentations, like the prints of a large animal, but elongated and strange, with claw-like impressions at the tips. Bob approached cautiously, his camera ready, his mind racing with possibilities. Bear tracks? No, too long and narrow. A large cat, perhaps? But there were no cats this far north, not in this weather, and certainly not leaving prints like these. He circled the strange markings, snapping photos from every angle, his breath shallow and uneven. As he examined the prints closer, he realized something that sent a chill through him. They weren't just randomly placed. They formed a pattern, a deliberate design that seemed almost ritualistic, spiraling outward from the center of the circle. His heart pounded in his chest as he thought back to the carved symbols on the tree, wondering if there was a connection, if someone, or something, was leaving a trail of signs. Suddenly, a sound broke the oppressive silence, a soft crunching, like footsteps on snow. Bob froze, his breath caught in his throat. The sound came again, closer this time, but from a different direction. He spun around, scanning the forest, but the fog was too thick, the trees too close together. The crunching stopped, replaced by the eerie stillness that made his skin crawl. He could feel his pulse in his ears, pounding like a drumbeat against the quiet. He knew he needed to stay calm. Panic could be deadly out here. He reached for his compass, but when he looked at it, the needle was spinning wildly, unable to settle. He tapped it, shook it, but it was useless. The forest seemed to distort even simple tools, as if trying to sever his connection to the outside world. Bob's grip tightened on the compass, and he forced himself to take a deep breath. His training told him to stay put, to wait and listen. But every fiber of his being screamed at him to move, to get out of this strange, unnatural clearing. And then he saw it, movement, just at the edge of his vision, a flicker between the trees. He turned, raising his camera like a shield, but again, there was nothing. Only the fog, rolling in thicker now, swallowing up the world around him. His finger hovered over the shutter, waiting, his breath shallow and rapid. For a moment, he thought he heard a low, guttural whisper, almost like his name carried on the wind, but it was so faint, so distant, he couldn't be sure. His mind raced with questions. Was someone out here? Were they following him? He wanted to call out, to demand who was there, but something deep inside him, the same instinct that had kept him alive on so many expeditions, warned him to stay silent. Instead, he slowly backed away from the clearing, careful to avoid stepping into the strange circle, his eyes never leaving the dark spaces between the trees. He needed to get back to his camp, regroup, and reassess. But even as he turned to leave, he knew one thing for certain. The deep woods of Crater Lake were not empty. And whatever was out there, it knew he was here. With every step back down the trail, the sense of urgency grew. The snow, once crisp underfoot, now seemed to cling to his boots like wet cement, making each movement laborious. And then, as if to mock his retreat, the whispering started again. This time unmistakable, a soft, undulating sound that seemed to rise and fall with the wind. It was closer now, wrapping around him like a cold breath, seeping into his ears and into his mind. And this time, it was clearer, more distinct. A voice, no longer distant but near, and almost familiar. Bob's pace quickened, his breath coming in rapid bursts as the whispering grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It felt like a pressure, pushing in on him from all sides, seeping into his very bones. He kept his eyes forward, trying to focus on the path ahead, but every few steps, he couldn't help but glance over his shoulder. The fog seemed thicker now, more oppressive, curling around the trees and obscuring his view of what lay behind. Shadows flitted at the edges of his vision, shapes that disappeared the moment he turned to look. The whispering wasn't just in his ears. It was inside his head, a low, droning hum that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. He could almost make out words, fragmented, half-formed syllables that merged into one another like a broken radio signal. And among those indistinct sounds, he thought he heard his name again, clearer this time, but twisted and drawn out in a way that made his skin crawl. Boo-boob. He stumbled, nearly losing his footing on the uneven ground. His hands instinctively reached out to steady himself against a nearby tree. The bark was cold and rough beneath his gloves, grounding him for a moment. But then he noticed something that made him pull back. Carved into the trunk, just above his hand, was another symbol, different from the ones he'd seen earlier, but equally disturbing. It was a crude, jagged mark that resembled an eye, staring out into the forest with an unblinking, malevolent gaze. Around it, the bark was stripped away, leaving the exposed wood pale and raw, almost as if it were wounded. Bob's heart raced. These markings weren't just random graffiti. They felt deliberate, purposeful, like some kind of warning or a signpost left by an unseen hand. His breaths came faster, shallower, the cold air burning his lungs. He knew he needed to keep moving, but the forest seemed to have other plans. It felt as if every path he chose looped back on itself, leading him deeper into this twisted, nightmarish maze. Was he circling back to where he'd started? The trees all looked the same, tall, dark, and looming, their branches like skeletal arms reaching for him. He pulled out his map, hoping for some clarity, but his hands were trembling too much to hold it steady. The lines and marks seemed to blur together, the paper damp from the fog and starting to tear at the edges. He turned in a slow circle, trying to orient himself, but every direction looked equally foreboding, equally wrong. His sense of direction, usually so reliable, had abandoned him. He could feel the panic starting to creep in, that gnawing fear that whispers of being truly, hopelessly lost. And then he heard it, a rustling, low and deliberate, coming from somewhere off to his left. He turned sharply, his camera ready, his breath held tight in his chest. There, just beyond the reach of the fog, he saw it again, the figure. This time, it was closer, more distinct. It stood just behind a cluster of trees, half hidden but undeniably there, its outline barely visible through the mist. Bob's pulse thundered in his ears as he stared at it, his eyes straining to see. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching him. He lifted his camera, his finger trembling on the shutter. For a split second, he considered calling out, demanding to know who or what it was. But something inside him, a primal, instinctive fear, kept him silent. He snapped a photo, the shutter clicking loudly in the stillness. For a brief moment, the flash illuminated the fog, casting a stark, harsh light over the figure. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The space where it had stood was empty, as if it had never been there at all. Bob's hands were shaking now, the camera slipping slightly in his grip. He checked the photo, his eyes scanning the image for any clue, any detail. But all he saw was the fog, thick and impenetrable, swallowing the trees in its cold embrace. There was no figure, no shadow, nothing to suggest that he wasn't alone. But he knew what he'd seen. He could still feel its eyes on him, that cold, piercing gaze boring into his back. He turned away, pushing forward with renewed urgency, his steps quick and uneven. The whispering had faded again, replaced by an even more unnerving silence. The forest seemed to breathe with him, every inhalation matched by a distant, almost imperceptible sigh. He felt his muscles tightening, his every nerve on edge. He could sense the presence growing nearer, the air around him heavy with anticipation. And then, through the dense wall of fog ahead, he saw a faint glow, a light. It was dim and flickering, barely more than a pinprick in the gloom, but it was there. Bob's heart leapt with a mix of hope and fear. Was it another camper? A ranger's outpost? Or something else entirely? He didn't know, but he had to find out. His feet carried him forward, each step faster than the last, the light becoming a beacon in the darkness. As he drew closer, the light began to take shape, revealing the vague outline of what looked like a small, ramshackle cabin. The windows were dark, the walls weathered and covered in moss, but the light flickered from inside, casting a weak, wavering glow through the fog. Bob hesitated for a moment, his breath fogging up the air. The cabin felt like an anomaly, an out-of-place relic in this twisted landscape. But it was a chance for shelter, for answers, or maybe just a momentary reprieve from the relentless presence that stalked him. Summoning his courage, he stepped toward the cabin, his eyes locked on that flickering light, unaware that with every step he took, the forest seemed to close in tighter, like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Bob's breath quickened as he reached the cabin, the soft glow from within its walls pulling him like a moth to a flame. Up close, the structure was even more decayed than it had appeared from a distance. Its wood darkened with age and weather, roof sagging under the weight of snow. The windows were cracked and clouded with frost, but through them, he could see the source of the light. A single, flickering oil lamp, its flame dancing erratically, as if disturbed by a draft. But there were no footprints in the snow leading to or away from the cabin. No signs of life. He hesitated on the threshold, his hand hovering over the rusted iron latch. His breath was shallow, clouding the air in front of him. The forest behind him seemed to press closer, the whispering still faintly audible, like 100 voices all speaking in hushed tones, just beyond the reach of his understanding. He had to make a choice. Stay out here, exposed and vulnerable, or step inside and face whatever lay within. Taking a deep breath, he pushed down on the latch. The door creaked open, a low, groaning sound that cut through the thick silence. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of damp wood and something else, something acrid and metallic. The flickering lamp sat on a small wooden table in the center of the room, casting long, erratic shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The walls were lined with shelves filled with strange, misshapen jars. Some contained murky liquids, others what looked like bundles of dried herbs or bones. An old, moth-eaten rug covered the floor, its edges curling up like the gnarled fingers of an old hand. Bob stepped inside cautiously, his every muscle tensed, his eyes darting around the room, searching for any sign of movement. He moved closer to the table, his footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust and grime. The lamp's flame flickered again, as if reacting to his presence, and the shadows danced wildly, distorting the small space around him. His gaze was drawn to the walls. More symbols, crudely etched into the wood, their lines jagged and desperate. Some were similar to the ones he had seen outside, but others were new, more complex, almost like a language he couldn't decipher. They seemed to pulse in the dim light, their shapes shifting in and out of focus. A chill ran down his spine. Bob reached for the lamp, intending to steady its flickering flame, but as his fingers brushed the cold metal, a sudden, deafening sound exploded behind him, the door slamming shut. He spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. The door stood closed, but now he could see that the frost on the window panes had thickened, creeping inward like icy veins. His breath fogged in the air, and he realized the temperature had dropped significantly, his breath coming out in frantic puffs. His instinct screamed at him to leave, to force the door open and run, but something stopped him. A low, rhythmic creaking, like the sound of a rocking chair slowly moving back and forth. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the room until they settled on the far corner. There, partially obscured by shadow, was an old wooden rocking chair. It was moving ever so slightly, swaying back and forth in a slow, deliberate rhythm, though there was no one sitting in it. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end. He felt like he was intruding on something private, something ancient and malevolent. The air seemed to hum with a low vibration, a barely perceptible sound that settled deep in his bones. Bob took a cautious step back, his gaze never leaving the rocking chair. The whispers returned, louder now, filling the small room with their dissonant chorus. He couldn't make out the words, but he could feel the malice behind them, a collective anger that seemed to swirl around him like a dark cloud. His eyes darted around, looking for anything that might offer a clue, a reason for what he was experiencing. That's when he saw it, on the far wall, hidden behind a stack of old, rotting firewood, a small, blackened doorway, barely big enough for a person to crawl through. Something in the back of his mind told him to stay away, that whatever lay beyond that doorway was not meant to be found. But a stronger, more insistent voice urged him on. He had come this far, and he couldn't turn back now. He approached the doorway slowly, his steps tentative, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The darkness beyond it seemed to pulse with a life of its own, an almost tangible presence that beckoned him forward. He crouched down, peering into the black void. There was nothing but darkness, an inky blackness that seemed to swallow up the light from the lamp. And yet, as he stared into it, he thought he could make out faint shapes, twisting and shifting like smoke. His hand tightened around his camera, the metal cold against his skin. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his ears, and leaned in closer, trying to see. Suddenly, a hand shot out from the darkness, cold and clammy, grabbing his wrist with a vice-like grip. Bob gasped, yanking his hand back instinctively, but the grip held firm. He could feel the cold seeping into his skin, spreading up his arm like ice water. Panic surged through him, and he pulled harder, trying to break free, but the hand pulled back with impossible strength, dragging him closer to the dark doorway. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices screaming in unison, filling his mind with a deafening roar. Bob's vision blurred, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could feel himself slipping, his strength draining away. But then, with one last desperate burst of adrenaline, he twisted his body and yanked back with all his might. The hand released him, and he stumbled back, falling hard against the table, the lamp toppling and spilling its oil onto the floor. The flame caught instantly, flaring up and sending a wave of heat through the room. The shadows on the walls twisted violently, and for a brief moment, Bob thought he saw something moving within them. Something tall and thin, with eyes that glowed like embers. The whispers turned to screams, a high-pitched wail that seemed to shake the very foundation of the cabin. He didn't wait to see more. He bolted for the door, his hand fumbling with the latch, his mind a blur of terror and confusion. With a final, desperate push, he forced the door open and stumbled out into the freezing night. The whispers faded instantly, replaced by the heavy, oppressive silence of the forest. He turned back to look at the cabin, its windows now dark, the flickering light gone. The door swung slowly shut behind him, and as it did, he felt the presence again. that same, unyielding gaze watching him from the darkness within. He didn't wait to find out what it was. He turned and ran, his footsteps pounding through the snow, the cold biting at his skin. The fog closed in around him, but he didn't care. He needed to get away, to put as much distance as possible between himself and that cursed place. But as he ran, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone, that something was following him, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. Bob's legs burned as he sprinted through the snow-laden forest, every breath tearing through his chest like icy shards. He could hear his heart pounding, each beat echoing in his ears louder than the whispers that had followed him. The fog was thicker than ever, a dense, suffocating blanket that swallowed the world around him. The trees seemed closer now, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, clawing at his jacket, trying to pull him back. His mind was a blur of panic and exhaustion, but he kept moving, driven by a primal need to survive. He didn't know how long he had been running when he finally stumbled to a stop, his lungs heaving and his muscles trembling with fatigue. The cold air burned his throat, and he doubled over, bracing his hands on his knees, struggling to catch his breath. For a moment, all he could hear was his own ragged breathing and the crunch of snow under his boots. The whispers had faded to a distant murmur, barely audible over the pounding of his heart. He looked around, trying to get his bearings, but the forest seemed different now, more twisted, more alien. The trees were taller, their trunks gnarled and bent, covered in a thick layer of frost that glistened in the dim light. The path he had been following had disappeared, swallowed up by the dense undergrowth. There was no sign of the cabin, no sign of anything familiar. He was lost. A deep sense of dread settled over him, heavier than the weight of his own fear. His mind raced with questions, each more frantic than the last. How had he gotten here? Was he moving in circles, or had the forest itself changed around him? He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He needed to think, to come up with a plan. His eyes scanned the trees, searching for any clue, any sign that might guide him back. And then he saw it. Something dark, almost black, peeking out from beneath the snow a few feet away. He approached cautiously, his breath coming in short, controlled bursts. As he got closer, he realized it was a piece of cloth, torn and ragged, half buried in the snow. He knelt down, reaching for it, his fingers brushing against the rough fabric. It was old, frayed at the edges, and covered in what looked like dark stains. His stomach tightened as he pulled it free, revealing more of the cloth beneath, a tattered, weathered jacket partially frozen to the ground. He knew that jacket. He had seen it in the photos, worn by a ranger who had disappeared years ago, one of the many lost souls who had vanished without a trace in these woods. His breath caught in his throat, and a cold sweat broke out on his skin. The stories, the warnings, they all flooded back to him. He wasn't the first to come here, drawn by the mystery, by the allure of the unknown. But how many had made it out? His hand trembled as he dropped the jacket back into the snow. His eyes darted around, half expecting to see someone standing just beyond the trees, watching him. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the silence deepening into something almost tangible, like a heavy fog pressing in on him. He stood up slowly, his instinct screaming at him to move, to keep going. He didn't know where he was headed, but he knew he couldn't stay here. He turned and started walking, his steps quick and purposeful, each footfall crunching loudly in the snow. The fog seemed to part slightly, revealing a narrow path winding through the trees, almost as if guiding him. He followed it, his eyes scanning the ground for any sign of danger. The air was colder now, biting at his face, seeping through his clothes. His hands were numb, and he could barely feel his fingers gripping the camera strap. But he couldn't stop. Not yet. After what felt like hours, he came upon a clearing, a small, open space surrounded by a circle of towering pine trees. In the center of the clearing stood a massive, ancient oak, its branches twisted and bare, like the withered limbs of a dying giant. The ground around it was oddly bare, free of snow, the earth dark and wet, as if freshly dug. A feeling of unease washed over him as he approached, his eyes drawn to the base of the tree. There, nestled among the roots, was a small, crude altar made of stones and bones, covered in a thin layer of frost. Bob's breath caught in his throat as he realized what he was looking at. This wasn't just a random collection of debris. This was a ritual site. The stones were arranged in a deliberate pattern, forming a circle around the base of the tree. At its center lay a small pile of bones. Animal bones, by the look of them, arranged in a way that seemed almost ceremonial. His pulse quickened as he stepped closer, his eyes tracing the lines of the symbols carved into the stones, the same symbols he had seen on the trees and in the cabin. A low, guttural sound broke the silence, a growl that seemed to come from the earth itself. Bob froze, his eyes darting around the clearing. He saw nothing, no movement, no sign of life. But he could feel it, a presence, something ancient and powerful, emanating from the very ground beneath his feet. The air around him seemed to hum with a low, vibrating energy, a deep, resonant frequency that he could feel in his bones. He took a step back, his instinct screaming at him to leave, to get as far away from this place as possible. But as he turned to go, he felt a sudden, sharp pain in his chest, like a cold blade slicing through his ribs. He gasped, doubling over, his hand clutching at his chest. The pain was intense, radiating through his body, his vision blurring with tears. He fell to his knees, the cold earth pressing against his skin, his breath coming in short, desperate gasps. The whispers returned, louder than ever, filling his mind with their dissonant chorus. He could hear them now, distinct voices, speaking in a language he didn't understand, but the intent was clear. They were calling to him, beckoning him deeper into the woods, into the dark veil that lay beyond. His body trembled with fear and exhaustion, his mind teetering on the edge of panic. And then, through the pain and the noise, he heard something else, a soft, melodic sound, almost like a lullaby. It was faint, barely audible over the din of the whispers, but it was there, drifting through the air like a gentle breeze. It seemed to come from somewhere deep within the forest, far beyond the clearing. For a moment, he felt a strange calm wash over him, a fleeting sense of peace amidst the chaos. He didn't know what it was, or why it called to him, but he knew he had to follow it. Summoning every ounce of strength left in his battered body, he pushed himself to his feet, his legs shaking beneath him. He took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the dark wall of trees that surrounded the clearing. The path ahead was hidden, obscured by shadow and fog, but he could feel it calling to him, a soft, insistent pull that tugged at his very soul. He took a step forward, then another, his body moving almost of its own accord, drawn toward the source of the sound. The whispers faded, replaced by the soft, melodic lullaby that seemed to guide him deeper into the forest. His fear melted away, replaced by a strange, almost hypnotic trance. He didn't know where he was going or what lay ahead, but he knew he had to keep moving, to keep following the song. Bob moved deeper into the forest, his steps slow and unsteady, guided only by the soft, haunting melody that floated through the mist. The song seemed to wind its way around the trees, slipping in and out of his hearing like a ghostly echo. It was beautiful, but also deeply unsettling. A lullaby that seemed to carry a weight of sorrow and longing. Each note vibrated through the air, resonating in his bones, compelling him forward. His mind felt hazy, a thin veil of consciousness draped over a chasm of exhaustion and fear. He no longer knew how long he had been walking or where he was headed. All that mattered was the song. The forest around him began to change again. The tall pines that towered over him grew closer together, their trunks thicker, their branches intertwined like skeletal fingers, forming a canopy that blocked out what little light remained. The fog seemed denser here, almost like smoke, clinging to his skin and seeping into his lungs with every breath. The ground underfoot was no longer soft snow but a tangle of roots and wet leaves, each step squelching loudly in the heavy silence. The whispering had faded, but he could feel something else, an oppressive stillness, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting. Suddenly, the song stopped. Bob froze in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. The silence that followed was absolute, a thick, impenetrable void that pressed against his ears. He glanced around, his eyes wide, searching for any sign of movement, any hint of what might have silenced the melody. But there was nothing. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant calls of birds or animals. Just the heavy, unnatural silence. His heart pounded in his chest, and he took a cautious step forward, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. And then, just as abruptly as it had stopped, the song started again. Only this time, it was different. The notes were slower, more drawn out, each one reverberating through the air like a distant, mournful wail. Bob felt a shiver run down his spine as he realized the sound was closer now, coming from somewhere just ahead. He took another step, then another, the pull of the melody growing stronger, more insistent. His breath came in short, shallow gasps, and he could feel the cold sweat clinging to his skin. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to run. But his feet kept moving, driven by a force he couldn't understand. The trees parted suddenly, and Bob found himself standing on the edge of a small, perfectly circular clearing. The ground here was covered in a thick layer of mist that swirled around his ankles like smoke. At the center of the clearing was a small, stone well, its sides covered in moss and lichen, as if it had been here for centuries. The song seemed to emanate from the well itself, its haunting melody drifting up from the darkness within. Bob felt his heart skip a beat. The air around him was cold, colder than it had been before, and he could see his breath misting in front of him with every exhale. He took a step closer, his eyes locked on the well. There was something about it that drew him in, a strange magnetism that pulled at his very soul. As he approached, he could see that the stones were ancient, weathered by time and the elements. Symbols were carved into the sides, more of the same strange, angular markings he had seen on the trees and in the cabin. But these were more elaborate, more intricate, almost like a story told in symbols. His eyes traced the lines, trying to make sense of them, but they seemed to shift and change under his gaze, twisting into new forms, new meanings. He reached the edge of the well and peered inside, his breath hitching in his throat. The darkness within was absolute, a deep, impenetrable void that seemed to stretch on forever. But as he stared into it, he thought he could see something moving, far below, a faint, shifting shadow that flickered in and out of existence. The song was louder now, resonating up from the depths like a siren's call. His hand tightened around the cold stone edge of the well, and he felt a strange urge to lean in closer, to listen more carefully, to understand. A sudden breeze swept through the clearing, cold and sharp, cutting through the fog like a knife. It carried with it a faint, distant sound, a child's laughter, soft and melodic, but distorted, like it was echoing through a vast, empty space. Bob's eyes widened, his heart racing. He knew that sound. It was the same laugh he'd heard on the tape recorder back in the cabin. His body tensed, every nerve screaming with alarm, but he couldn't pull away. The song was in his mind now, burrowing deep into his thoughts, twisting them into something foreign, something dark. The laughter grew louder, more distorted, overlapping with the melody in a discordant symphony that set his teeth on edge. He felt his grip on the stone tightening, his knuckles turning white. His mind was spinning, his thoughts becoming jumbled and incoherent. Images flashed before his eyes, faces he didn't recognize, places he'd never been, all twisted and warped like a nightmare come to life. And through it all, the laughter continued, rising to a fever pitch, mingling with the song until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. Without thinking, Bob leaned further over the edge of the well, his eyes straining to see into the darkness below. His breath came in short, panicked gasps, his heart thundering in his chest. The shadows at the bottom of the well seemed to shift and twist, forming shapes that defied logic, elongated limbs, gaping mouths, eyes that glowed with a dim, eerie light. He could feel them staring up at him, their gaze piercing through the darkness, reaching into his very soul. His vision blurred, and he felt himself swaying, his body teetering on the brink. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the song stopped. The laughter ceased. The clearing fell silent once more. Bob blinked, his breath coming in ragged gulps as he pulled back from the edge, his hands trembling. The oppressive silence returned, heavier than before, pressing in on him from all sides. He could feel the weight of the well's presence, its dark, ancient power radiating outward like a cold, dead sun. He needed to leave, to get as far away from this place as possible. But as he turned to go, something caught his eye. Something small and white, half buried in the moss near the base of the well. He knelt down, his hands shaking as he brushed away the moss, revealing a small, weathered object, a bone, long and slender, like a finger. His stomach churned, and he felt bile rise in his throat. He looked around frantically, and suddenly, he saw them. More bones, scattered among the roots and leaves, partially hidden by the mist. Some were small, like those of a child. Others were larger, more jagged, broken. He realized with a sickening dread that the clearing was not just a place of ritual, it was a graveyard. The air seemed to thicken, the fog closing in around him like a shroud. His breath quickened, panic setting in. He stood up, his eyes darting around for a way out. But before he could move, he heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper, drifting up from the well. It was a single word, spoken in a voice that was both familiar and alien, like a distant echo of his own thoughts. It simply said, "Come." Bob's heart stopped. His legs felt like lead, his body frozen in place. He could feel the darkness pressing in on him, pulling him back toward the well, back toward whatever lay in its depths. He fought the urge to turn around, to look back, knowing that if he did, he might never be able to turn away again. Summoning every ounce of willpower, he forced himself to move, to step away from the well, one foot in front of the other. But as he did, the whispering grew louder, more urgent, a cacophony of voices all calling out to him, pleading, demanding. His head throbbed with the noise, his vision blurring. He broke into a run, his feet pounding against the earth, the bones crunching underfoot. The clearing blurred around him, the fog swallowing him whole as he fled deeper into the woods, away from the well, away from the voices, away from the darkness that seemed to follow him like a shadow. Bob stumbled through the fog-covered forest, his mind a maelstrom of fear and disorientation. The trees seemed to close in on him, their gnarled branches reaching out like dark fingers, their shadows twisting into grotesque shapes in the dim light. He ran without direction, driven by a primal urge to escape the unseen terror that seemed to follow him. The mist swirled around his legs, making every step feel like he was wading through a sea of ghostly tendrils. His breath came in ragged gasps, each inhalation sharp and painful as the cold air seared his lungs. The whispers had returned, but now they were different, more urgent, more frantic, as if they were trying to communicate something he couldn't quite grasp. They echoed through the trees, overlapping and intertwining in a chaotic symphony of sound. He couldn't make out any specific words, but the tone was unmistakable. A desperate plea, a warning, or perhaps a mockery of his fear. The forest seemed alive with these disembodied voices, their murmurs weaving through the branches and beneath the ground. Bob's sense of direction was utterly lost. The fog had swallowed all landmarks, rendering his surroundings a featureless void of shifting shadows and muted colors. Each step felt like it led him deeper into a labyrinth with no exit. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see something, or someone, pursuing him, but the fog revealed nothing but empty trees and the fading echoes of his own footfalls. As he pushed forward, he began to notice subtle changes in the forest. The ground beneath him became uneven, strewn with rocks and fallen branches. The trees grew taller and more twisted, their trunks gnarled and knotted as if they had been shaped by some malevolent force. The fog grew thicker, more oppressive, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. The only sounds were the constant whispers and the crunch of his footsteps, echoing eerily in the stillness. He came across a peculiar sight, a large, ancient tree with a hollow trunk that seemed to glow faintly from within. Intrigued and desperate for any sign of direction, Bob approached it cautiously. As he neared the tree, he noticed symbols carved into its bark, similar to those he had seen at the well. They were more elaborate here, forming a complex pattern that seemed to pulse with a faint, otherworldly light. The air around the tree felt warmer, almost inviting, a stark contrast to the cold, damp mist that surrounded him. Despite his apprehension, Bob felt a strange compulsion to investigate the hollow. He reached out and touched the symbols, feeling a faint vibration under his fingertips. The glow from within the tree seemed to intensify, casting an eerie light across the clearing. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, their voices melding into a single, coherent plea. It was as if the tree itself was trying to communicate with him, offering some form of guidance or escape. Summoning his courage, Bob peered into the hollow. The darkness inside was deep and impenetrable, but there was something else, a faint, pulsing light, like a distant star. He could barely make out the shape of something lying at the bottom, obscured by shadows. He hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and reached inside. His fingers brushed against something cold and smooth, and he pulled it out with a trembling hand. It was an old-fashioned lantern, its glass cracked and tarnished with age. The light inside flickered weakly, casting dim shadows on the surrounding trees. Bob's heart raced with a mixture of relief and dread. Here was a source of light, a potential means of finding his way out, or it could be another trap, another part of the forest's twisted game. He decided to take the lantern, feeling a glimmer of hope. If nothing else, it would provide some illumination in the encroaching darkness. As he examined the lantern, he noticed something else, a scrap of paper wedged inside the metal casing. He carefully unfolded it, his fingers stiff and numb. The paper was old and yellowed, covered in a scrawling, almost illegible handwriting. It was a note, written in a hurried, frantic script. The message was barely decipherable, but a few words stood out clearly: follow the light, find the path, and beware the shadows. Bob's pulse quickened as he read the note. It seemed to be a message from someone who had been lost in these woods before him, someone who had left behind a warning or a clue. He felt a renewed sense of urgency. The lantern might be his only chance to find his way out, but he had to be cautious. The note's warning about the shadows was a stark reminder of the dangers that lurked in the darkness. He took a deep breath, clutching the lantern tightly. The whispers seemed to quieten, replaced by a tense, expectant silence. Bob turned and began to walk, the lantern's weak light casting long, flickering shadows across the forest floor. The fog seemed to part slightly, revealing a narrow path that wound its way through the trees. He followed it, his eyes scanning the surrounding darkness for any sign of movement, any hint of the shadows mentioned in the note. The path was uneven, winding through the twisted trees and over rocky ground. The lantern's light flickered erratically, casting strange, shifting shapes on the ground and walls of the forest. Each step seemed to take him further into the heart of the darkness, the oppressive silence growing heavier with each passing moment. The whispers had faded completely, replaced by a profound, almost deafening quiet. Bob's mind was racing, his thoughts consumed by the note's warning and the ever-present sense of dread. The path twisted and turned, leading him deeper into the forest. The trees seemed to close in around him, their branches forming a dense canopy that blocked out the last traces of daylight. The fog was thick again, swirling around his legs and obscuring his vision. He could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on him, a palpable sense of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight. As he continued on, the lantern's light began to wane, its glow dimming to a faint, ghostly shimmer. Bob's heart pounded in his chest as he realized that the light was fading, that he was once again surrounded by darkness. He quickened his pace, his footsteps echoing in the silence, his breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. The path ahead seemed to stretch on endlessly, the darkness growing thicker with each step. Suddenly, he saw something in the distance, a faint, flickering light that seemed to beckon him forward. It was a warm, golden glow, starkly contrasting with the cold, oppressive darkness that surrounded him. His hopes surged at the sight of it. Could this be the way out? The path he had been searching for? He forced himself to run toward the light, his steps heavy and unsteady, his mind focused solely on reaching the source. As he approached, the light grew brighter, revealing a small cabin nestled in a clearing. The lantern's glow illuminated the cabin's weathered walls and the surrounding area, casting long, eerie shadows. Bob's heart leapt with a mix of relief and trepidation. Was this the same cabin he had seen earlier, or had he found a new one, a potential sanctuary? He could only hope that it held the answers he so desperately needed. With a final, desperate surge of energy, he reached the cabin's door, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. The lantern's light flickered one last time, then went out completely, plunging him into darkness. He took a deep breath, bracing himself for whatever lay beyond the door. His fingers gripped the handle, and with a slow, deliberate motion, he turned it and pushed the door open. The cabin's interior was shrouded in darkness, the air stale and musty. Bob stepped inside, his heart pounding with anticipation and fear. He had reached the light, but what awaited him in this forsaken place was still unknown. The whispers, the shadows, the darkness, they all seemed to converge on this single moment as he crossed the threshold into the unknown. As Bob stepped into the cabin, he was met with a dense, suffocating darkness. The air was cold and stale, carrying the faint smell of decay and mold. He fumbled for a moment, his hands reaching out in search of a source of light, but found only the rough, weathered wood of the walls. His heart pounded in his chest, a frantic rhythm that matched the increasing pressure in his head. The lantern's light had died, leaving him in a darkness so profound it felt almost tangible. He took a cautious step forward, his footfalls muffled by the thick layer of dust covering the floor. The silence was almost unbearable, punctuated only by the soft creaks of the cabin settling around him. He felt his way along the walls, searching for any sign of a light source or a way to illuminate the room. His fingers brushed against an old, wooden shelf, its surface cluttered with objects that felt cold and unfamiliar. With a deep breath, Bob groped around the cabin until he found an old oil lamp resting on the shelf. He examined it with trembling hands, relieved to see that it was intact. After a few minutes of struggling, he managed to light the lamp, its flickering flame casting a weak but steady glow around the room. The light revealed a scene of abandonment, with old, tattered furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. As the lamp's light grew steadier, Bob's eyes adjusted to the dim illumination. He could see the cabin in greater detail now. The walls were lined with faded photographs, their frames cracked and broken. The photos depicted various scenes of the forest and the lake, but they were unsettling. Each image seemed to show the same places over and over, but with subtle, disturbing differences. Figures that looked like shadows or distorted shapes appeared in the background, barely noticeable but undeniably present. Bob's gaze was drawn to a large desk in the center of the room. Papers were strewn across it, along with a typewriter and several empty whiskey bottles. He approached the desk, brushing aside the dust to reveal the documents. The papers were filled with frantic notes and sketches, written in a hurried scrawl that was almost impossible to read. But amidst the chaos, certain phrases stood out. "The darkness knows," "The path leads here," and "Don't look back." His stomach churned as he pieced together the notes. It became clear that someone had been here before him, someone who had been driven to madness by the forest and its secrets. The notes spoke of a darkness that could not be escaped, of a path that led to something terrible hidden deep within the woods. Bob felt a cold sweat forming on his brow. The eerie coincidences between the notes and his own experiences were too unsettling to ignore. He noticed a drawer in the desk and opened it, revealing a collection of old journals. The first few pages were filled with similar frantic writings, describing a sense of impending doom and a growing obsession with the forest. But as he flipped through the pages, he came across something different: hand-drawn maps and sketches of the forest, marked with symbols similar to those he had seen at the well. The maps showed various trails and landmarks, all leading to a single point marked ominously with a dark, swirling symbol. Bob's mind raced as he studied the maps. It seemed as though the previous occupant of the cabin had been searching for something specific, something hidden deep within the forest. The swirling symbol on the map was the same as the one he had seen carved into the tree near the well. The realization hit him with a jolt. The well was not just a random, eerie feature. It was a key, a focal point in a larger, more sinister design. His thoughts were interrupted by a faint noise from outside, a distant, unsettling sound that sent a chill down his spine. It was a low, mournful wail, echoing through the forest and seeping into the cabin like a ghostly presence. The sound grew louder, more insistent, and Bob realized with growing horror that it was moving closer. He glanced out the window, but the darkness outside was impenetrable, the fog thick and unyielding. He turned back to the desk, his mind reeling from the implications of what he had discovered. The notes, the maps, the eerie photographs, they all pointed to something terrible waiting in the depths of the forest. The wail grew louder, now a full-fledged, anguished cry that seemed to reverberate through the cabin's walls. Bob's breath came in short, rapid gasps as he tried to calm himself. He knew he had to leave the cabin, to get back on the path and find a way out of the forest before whatever was making that noise found him. He gathered the journals and maps, shoving them into his bag along with the lantern. With a final, terrified glance around the cabin, he turned and headed for the door. As he stepped outside, the cold, damp fog enveloped him once more. The wail was now a piercing, almost otherworldly sound, reverberating through the trees and creating a sense of impending doom. Bob's heart raced as he made his way down the path, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The forest seemed to close in around him, the shadows lengthening and shifting as if alive. He followed the path indicated on the map, desperately trying to stay focused despite the growing sense of dread. The lantern's light flickered erratically, casting eerie, dancing shadows across the trees. The wail continued, relentless, mournful cry that seemed to chase him through the fog. As he moved forward, he realized with mounting horror that the forest seemed to be changing around him. The trees, once familiar, now appeared twisted and alien, their branches forming grotesque shapes that seemed to reach out for him. The fog grew thicker, swirling in unnatural patterns, and the path ahead seemed to stretch on endlessly. Bob's mind was racing, the weight of his discoveries and the relentless wail creating a suffocating pressure. The forest was no longer just a maze of trees and shadows. It was a living, breathing entity, with its own dark will and purpose. And as he pressed on, he could only hope that he was following the right path, that he would find a way out before it was too late. The cabin receded into the mist behind him, its haunting presence a reminder of the darkness that lay hidden in the depths of the deep woods. Bob continued to walk, driven by a mixture of fear and determination, knowing that his survival depended on unraveling the forest's secrets and escaping its grip before the wail became a final, all-consuming darkness. Bob pushed forward through the oppressive darkness, his breath coming in short, frantic bursts. The fog enveloped him, thick and impenetrable, creating a disorienting haze that seemed to swallow the path ahead. Each step was a struggle, his feet sinking into the uneven ground as he navigated through the shifting shadows. The wail continued, a haunting cry that seemed to follow him, echoing through the forest and amplifying the growing sense of dread that gnawed at his nerves. Despite his efforts to stay focused, Bob felt an increasing sense of disorientation. The trees around him seemed to twist and warp, their gnarled branches forming strange, grotesque shapes in the dim light of the lantern. The path, once clear and distinct, now appeared to meander endlessly, leading him deeper into the heart of the darkness. The symbols on the map he had found in the cabin provided little comfort. They seemed to guide him in circles, the lines and markings blurring into a chaotic maze. His mind raced with fear and exhaustion. The notes and maps had indicated a specific location, a point of convergence in the forest. But as he continued, the landmarks on the map became increasingly unrecognizable. The familiar features of the forest, rock outcroppings, unusual trees, seemed to change with each turn, as if the forest itself were actively trying to confuse him. The whispers had returned, faint and elusive, weaving in and out of his consciousness. They were not coherent voices, but rather an unsettling murmur that seemed to emanate from the very air around him. Bob's sense of time had become distorted. The darkness made it difficult to judge the passage of minutes or hours. He had no idea how long he had been walking or how far he had traveled. The lantern's light flickered weakly, its glow barely penetrating the dense fog. Every now and then, he would catch glimpses of movement in the corners of his vision, shadows darting between the trees, fleeting shapes that vanished before he could fully comprehend them. Each fleeting sight was enough to set his heart racing, fueling his fear of what might be lurking just out of sight. The wail grew louder, more insistent, as if it were drawing closer. Bob's pace quickened despite his exhaustion, driven by a primal need to escape the relentless sound. He scanned the forest for any sign of a way out, but the darkness offered no respite. The forest seemed to close in on him, the trees leaning in as if to trap him within their grasp. Just as his strength began to wane, he noticed a faint, eerie light ahead. It was a distant, almost ethereal glow that seemed to beckon him forward. The light was unlike anything he had seen before, soft and almost pulsing, casting a pale illumination through the fog. Bob felt a flicker of hope. Could this be the way out, or was it another trick of the forest? He pushed forward towards the light, his steps becoming more urgent. The path grew narrower, the trees pressing closer together, their branches intertwining in a dense canopy. The fog seemed to part slightly, revealing a narrow, winding trail that led directly towards the source of the light. Bob followed it, his eyes fixed on the glow as it grew brighter with each step. As he drew closer, the light revealed itself to be a strange, otherworldly phenomenon. A circle of softly glowing stones arranged in a pattern on the forest floor. The stones were smooth and perfectly round, each emitting a gentle, pulsating light that created an almost hypnotic effect. Within the circle, a small, crude altar made of twisted branches and stones stood. It was covered in strange symbols and offerings, bones, feathers, and small, grotesque figures carved from wood. The wail had stopped, replaced by a heavy, almost tangible silence. Bob approached the circle cautiously, his eyes scanning the symbols and offerings with a mix of curiosity and dread. The symbols were similar to those he had seen at the well and in the cabin. Complex, intricate designs that seemed to swirl and shift as he looked at them. He noticed a small, ornate box resting on the altar. It was carved with the same swirling patterns and had a lock, old and rusted. The box seemed to hum with a faint energy, as if it were alive. Bob felt a strange compulsion to open it, to see what was inside. His fingers trembled as he reached for the box, the sense of foreboding growing stronger with each passing moment. With a deep breath, he managed to pry open the lock. The lid creaked as he lifted it, revealing the contents inside. The box was filled with small, meticulously arranged items, fragments of paper, bits of string, and other seemingly random objects. But one item stood out, a small, leather-bound journal, its cover worn and faded. Bob's heart skipped a beat. Could this be another journal, perhaps one with more information about the forest's secrets? He picked up the journal, his hands shaking as he opened it. The pages were filled with neat, precise handwriting, documenting events and observations. The entries detailed rituals and ceremonies performed in the forest, descriptions of the symbols, and accounts of strange occurrences. The journal's author had been deeply immersed in the forest's dark mysteries, documenting everything they had learned. As Bob read through the journal, he discovered references to a ritual performed to appease the spirits of the forest, to protect oneself from the malevolent forces that lurked within. The author described a powerful entity, a dark presence that fed on fear and despair, and warned of its ability to manifest in various forms. The journal spoke of a final ritual, a way to end the forest's influence and find peace. Bob's mind raced as he absorbed the information. The ritual described in the journal matched some of the symbols and practices he had encountered. If he could perform the ritual, he might be able to break free from the forest's grip and escape its dark influence. With renewed determination, Bob carefully placed the journal back into the box and closed it. He took a deep breath, bracing himself for the task ahead. The forest's darkness still pressed in around him, but he felt a glimmer of hope that he might find a way to end the terror and escape the relentless wail that had pursued him. The path to safety lay before him, and he knew he had to act quickly to put an end to the forest's dark hold. With the journal clutched tightly in his hands, Bob left the circle of glowing stones and made his way back along the narrow path, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and trepidation. The forest, once a maze of shifting shadows, now seemed to hold its breath, as if anticipating the culmination of his journey. The oppressive darkness had lessened slightly, but the fog remained thick and heavy, swirling around his legs with an unsettling persistence. He retraced his steps carefully, guided by the map and the notes he had gathered. The forest appeared almost silent, the wail that had haunted him now replaced by an eerie stillness. The trees loomed ominously, their gnarled branches casting long, distorted shadows in the dim light of the lantern. The symbols from the journal guided him, marking the path towards the focal point of the forest's dark influence. As he approached the location indicated on the map, Bob felt a growing sense of dread. The air grew colder, the fog denser, and the forest seemed to come alive with a malevolent energy. He reached a small clearing, surrounded by ancient, twisted trees that formed a natural barrier. In the center of the clearing stood a large stone altar, covered in the same swirling symbols he had seen before. Bob set the journal on the ground and began to prepare for the ritual described in its pages. He arranged the symbols and offerings as instructed, his movements steady but anxious. Each item had to be placed precisely, each symbol drawn with careful attention to detail. The forest seemed to watch him, the shadows shifting and elongating as if responding to his actions. As he worked, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. They seemed to swirl around him, overlapping and merging into a cacophony of disembodied voices. The whispers grew into a chant, a dark, rhythmic incantation that matched the ritual's instructions. Bob's heart raced, but he pressed on, determined to complete the ritual and end the forest's influence. With the altar prepared, he took a deep breath and began the final part of the ritual. He recited the incantation from the journal, his voice trembling but resolute. The words felt heavy on his tongue, each syllable charged with a power he could barely comprehend. As he spoke, the symbols on the altar began to glow faintly, their light pulsing in rhythm with his chant. The forest reacted violently. The fog thickened, swirling into a vortex of dark, roiling clouds. The trees groaned and creaked, their branches bending and twisting as if in agony. The shadows around the clearing deepened, taking on grotesque forms that seemed to reach out towards Bob. The oppressive force of the forest was tangible, a dark pressure that pressed against him from all sides. Despite the growing terror, Bob continued with the ritual. His voice grew stronger, the chant becoming a powerful incantation that resonated through the clearing. The glowing symbols on the altar intensified, their light brightening and pushing back the encroaching darkness. The forest seemed to resist, the shadows fighting against the light, but Bob's determination did not waver. As he reached the climax of the ritual, a sudden, deafening roar erupted from the forest, a primal, bone-chilling sound that seemed to shake the very ground beneath him. The clearing was bathed in a blinding light as the symbols on the altar flared up, their glow searing through the darkness. The oppressive force that had haunted him seemed to writhe and recoil, as if being driven back by the ritual's power. Bob finished the chant, his voice ringing out with a final, triumphant note. The light from the altar reached a crescendo, flooding the clearing with a pure, radiant energy. The darkness that had engulfed the forest began to dissipate, the fog lifting and the shadows retreating. The oppressive pressure lifted, replaced by a calm, almost serene stillness. The roar faded, leaving only the gentle rustling of the trees and the distant sounds of nature. The forest, once a dark and malevolent entity, now seemed peaceful, its twisted shapes and shadows softened in the light of the dawn. The clearing was bathed in a soft, golden glow, and the oppressive darkness had vanished. Bob took a moment to catch his breath, his body trembling with exhaustion and relief. The ritual had worked, driving back the dark presence and breaking the forest's grip. He looked around, taking in the transformed landscape with a mixture of awe and gratitude. The path to safety seemed clearer now, the way out of the forest more distinct. With the journal in hand, Bob made his way back to the edge of the forest, guided by the light of the rising sun. The forest, once a place of fear and darkness, had been transformed into a place of quiet, serene beauty. As he emerged from the woods, the familiar landscape of Crater Lake National Park greeted him, the sky bright and clear. Bob's ordeal was over, but the experience had changed him forever. The forest's dark secrets had been uncovered, its malevolent presence driven back. As he looked out over the lake, he felt a deep sense of relief and closure. The darkness had been vanquished, and he had found his way back to the light.